Okay, I'm going to show you now how to create sort of an underwater scene. And we're just going to be basically focusing on environment. So that includes the water and the lighting. Now, one thing that makes an underwater environment spectacular looking and a lot more realistic is the ability to fake caustics. And that would be the creation of sort of the beams that you see on the ground, where you'll see kind of those wave effects on objects, and also streaking if we use volumetrics, where we can get some nice light rays. And we can also animate that, which I'm going to show you in just a minute. But first thing we want to do is load in our water plane, and we want to go ahead and lift this up a little ways above the camera. And now we already pretty much have our water scene set up. It looks like it's underwater, but we have this very light blue area back here, and we want to get rid of that. So we're going to go to Atmosphere and the Atmosphere Editor, and we want to change under Fog and Haze, we're going to change our fog color to a dark blue, and more towards the greenish side, and a little bit lower. And we want to increase our fog levels to kind of get rid of that effect. And we could also adjust that color too, because now it's kind of graying out a little. Maybe we'll make it bring it up a little so it's a little less gray, and now we have a little more color in there. And if we remove our haze, we'll see a better effect there too. Of course, you can add haze, but that will create this very harsh fall off, and we don't really want too much of a fall off here. So we're just going to leave it with these settings. And of course, like I said, you can adjust that as much as you want to get as much fog as you want. And depending on how much you have in the scene, you might not even need to worry about the horizon anyway. Let's go ahead and click OK. And now we're going to take a look at actually creating our light for this. And we're going to be using a quadric spotlight. So we're going to right mouse click down here and create a quadric spotlight. And the reason we're going to use a quadric spotlight is because the fall off is much quicker, and it's going to produce a much more realistic result than if we were to use a standard spotlight. So I'm going to go ahead and move this out from our camera, and we got to keep in mind too that all our light rays that are going to be coming from this light will only show up within this kind of cone right here. So we want to make sure we increase our spread a little, and that way we'll get a much larger environment for these rays to be casting. And then I want to go ahead and kind of angle them a bit, and I'm going to angle them towards the camera. So we'll just rotate that just a little, and now we have this spotlight kind of angled towards the camera. We also want to adjust our power, and that way all the beams will be produced fully through the water and down to our ground plane. Okay, and now we want to actually add our gel, which is going to block out our specific light rays, because we can go ahead and turn on volumetrics right now, which is just going to give us a very steady looking effect in the water, and there's no streaks. The only streaks that are really in there are kind of poor render quality, and that's why those are being caused. But we need to block out certain areas to actually cause a nice caustic looking effect with light rays. So what we need to do is click on this little light bulb up here with kind of the checker effect on it, and left mouse click on that. And unfortunately, we cannot edit the gel until we've selected a base material. So you want to select a very simple material for this. I'm just going to use this flat white, but any of these will work too. We could also use the flat gray. Actually, I'll just use the flat gray. It doesn't really matter. Just as long as it's a simple material and not complex, where we don't really have to edit the functions too much, because we don't want anything in the function editor we have to change. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now we can right mouse click and go to Edit Gel. Now, to edit this gel, we're going to be using a image map to produce this effect, because it's going to look best with an image map. So I'm going to right mouse click and go to Edit Function. And we're going to have to do this within the function editor, which is going to produce the best results. And we're going to click Add Texture Map Node, making sure that color is selected. I'm going to change our UV coordinates to flat vertical, because it's just going to be a flat plane that's pretty much in front of the light that the light is shining through, sort of an invisible plane. And then we can load in an image, and you can find these images in the content directory in the underwater folder. And we have large and small. We're going to use the large right now, which is actually going to produce larger beams, and we could also have the small, which is also going to produce the same kind of effect but smaller beams of light. And now this is also an animation sequence, so we can load this as as an animation sequence and actually have this all animated so we can see those light rays moving, which is kind of a really neat effect. Now sometimes, depending on whichever way is set up, it will ask you if you want to load in an animation sequence. I think because of the naming on the large ones, it might not ask you. If we load in one of the small ones and click OK, it didn't ask us there either. So we can go to animation map if you actually want to load in that full animation, and just browse, and we can load in, select our first or any one of the files and click open, and now we have our animation sequence automatically loaded, which means we could scrub through it and you'll see the effects. If we do a preview render, you'll see the light beams all changing throughout the animation, which this is also linked to time. Now if we want to too, we could also do this with transparency, which we should probably do, and we'll just load that up, just clicking that map, and it will automatically detect that we use this other one as sort of the default. And we'll just change it to flat vertical, and now they're equal. And then we have a little bit of transparency in there. We can click OK. And now if we take a look at our preview, you're going to notice we have these light beams in here. And also on the ground, if we take a look under the water at the actual surface of the ground and what's being projected on it, you can see those little beams on there as well. Maybe we'll zoom out just a little so we can see it a little bit better. And depending on the power, of course, that's going to affect that. If we increase our power, we'll produce a much brighter result, and we'll end up seeing a lot more on the ground. And here you can really see them in here, and we kind of get that underwater look from this. Of course, you could use any image map you want. If you have something better that's going to show your caustics, use that. This is just something I rendered in Lightwave with some of the procedurals that are available in there and one of the underwater effects, and actually created a loopable image sequence. So keep in mind this is loopable, and you can keep playing this over and over, but it's not tileable, so it's not seamless. So we'll go up and take a look at these beams here. And you can see that's a very bright effect, the sun coming in. But of course we could adjust that by adjusting our power. And we could also adjust that with our volumetric settings. Right now it looks very grainy, so of course if we want, we can go to Edit Volumetric Settings, and we can give it a quality boost all the way up to the top, and click OK, and that will reduce some of the graininess. And another way to reduce that graininess and make any volumetric effect look better is if we go to our render options and actually go to our user settings and take a look at advanced effects quality. We could either raise that all the way up to better, or if we want to use custom settings where we have other things involved in the scene, we can go down to the bottom with volumetrics and increase that if we wanted to. So we could also use our custom settings and increase how many samples we have and bring these all the way up to better, and that will remove your grainy the grain from that entirely, but it will take a long time to render. So we'll just close out of that. I'm going to bring this down a little bit smaller right now so we get a quicker render, and click OK. Now you'll also notice with these light beams that, like I said, because it is linked to an animation sequence, they will be animated. So we're going to display timeline, and I'm just going to create a quick couple second animation. Just go to 5 seconds, and we're going to add a position keyframe for our light. Even though we're not moving it at all, it's the easiest way to create an actual animation. And if we take a look at our preview render now, we should see a change in our light beams. And keep in mind too, some of the parts of this animation are not entirely animated. Some of the beams are going to remain stationary. The thicker ones will remain stationary because of the type of image sequence that it is. But if we look at the ground and take a look at some of the smaller effects, as you can see, these small little ones, rings right here, will be moving, but some of the larger ones, we might see some larger ones through here, those will stay stationary. But it's still going to produce a really neat effect. And another thing that comes about from that is the actual objects in the scene and how those will look with that light being casted on them. So if we take a look at our ball objects we just loaded in here, we can already see our light beams are shining on it, and it's going to produce a really neat effect. So if we do a preview render of that, we'll see our ripples moving across all of our objects underwater, and it's going to produce a really, really neat effect. So you really have to fake the caustics because Vue won't automatically put in these light beams, so this is really the only way to do it right now. And you can just, if you want stronger light beams, we can just go ahead and adjust the power. or you could go into volumetric settings and adjust the intensity of that actual volumetric beam. We'll just let it render there, and we made it just a little bit brighter. We get some really neat effects in there. Also, too, with shadows on, you always want to make sure when you're doing this effect that you have shadows turned on. You want cast shadows for your quadric spotlight. And if we take a look, too, if we bring this ball up a little bit higher, we're going to notice the shadows are actually being cast in there, so we're blocking out beams underneath it. So now you can see all the beams that are underneath it are going to be blocked out. So as we move our ball through the beams, they will be blocked out, and it'll be kind of a neat effect. But one other thing is the shadow. If we take a look at the shadow from the sun, it is a little bit off and doesn't really match up with our light. So we do want to make sure that we have our light facing the correct direction. Now, as you notice, I just created sort of an animation path with that. So I'm going to go to Animation, Destroy Object Animation, and make sure we're back at the starting point. I also probably created one with the camera as well, so we could destroy that as well, just so that we don't have an animation conflicting with everything. And now we can go back to that sunlight, and make sure you're on frame 0 whenever you're making any major changes that are not going to be animated. So now we want to take a look at this light. We've moved our sun, so it is kind of casting shadows where it should. But the other thing is, underwater, you're not going to have such harsh shadows. And in real life, you probably wouldn't have such harsh shadows either. So there's a way to adjust that. You could either use the softness. We could do that with the sunlight and use softness on there. But the only problem is that can take a long time to render because you have to have very high quality settings, high anti-aliasing, and things like that in order to produce a realistic result. So what we actually want to do is create a shadow map. So I'm going to go ahead and actually move this over just a little bit more because that shadow isn't quite where it should be. And we're going to take a look at our shadow options. So we're going to right mouse click on this button right here and go to Edit Shadow and Lighting. And now if we click Use Shadow Map, we can now, the shadow map is kind of producing an image map for the shadow, which we can base on an actual size, 512 pixels it's set at right now, or we can use the auto size function, and then that size will change to a ratio, which we can change if we want to, and also change our maximum size. Auto size usually produces a pretty good result, but if you're going to be rendering much more high resolution frames, you're going to want to actually go in and manually type in, let's say 2048 on there, and get a much higher size. But we want to also select Soft Shadow Map, so this way we don't get any hard shadows. And what we can also do is adjust how dark the shadows are. So I'm going to click OK right now without adjusting how dark our shadows are, and we'll take a look at our preview and really see our shadow underneath. We can see it's all kind of blurred out now. But depending on how much the light is being dispersed under the water, you might want to change that shadow and maybe not have it so dark. So we can go back into that Edit Shadow and Lighting and change how dark our shadows are. And if I bring it down to, let's say 39% and click OK, and now take a look at our preview and see what happens. You can see that our shadow is, of course, much dimmer now. And this works for any effects. It doesn't necessarily have to be underwater. This will work for any of your shadow options on any of your lights. And keep in mind, too, this is just for the shadow for our sunlight and not for our spotlight. Because of our gel on here, we're not really producing any major shadows on here because of this light and its gel. So we don't really have to worry about that too much. But we are getting a nice effect from our sunlight, which is giving us a nice soft shadow, which is based on that shadow map. Now, if you have a large-scale scene, shadow maps probably won't be your best choice, just because if you have a huge ecosystem and tons of shadows being casted by one light, then a shadow map would have to be rather large in order to produce a good result. But if you're just using a few objects, this works out okay, and you can do some really neat effects. With the underwater effects, it looks great, because we can get some really neat stuff in here. But I wouldn't worry about it too much for your major scenes, just because if you have too many objects, like I said, you'll have to bump up that shadow map quite large, and that could eat up a lot of memory in your system. And another thing we could do to also add a little more realism to this underwater effect is if we go to our quadric spotlight, right mouse click on the volumetric settings, and go to Edit Volumetric Settings, we can adjust and add Show Smoke or Dust in Light Beam. And what this is going to do is use a procedural texture within the function editor and add little bits of dust and variation in the lightness overall. So if you want murky water, lots of fragments in there, lots of little particles floating around, this is the way to do it. And you can also adjust a filter for that to see how linear or nonlinear it is, or even have one of the major filters in there where you have up and down, different things like that. And then we could also edit the function. And right now I believe this is a fractal node. Yes, it is. So we are using a fractal node to produce these different effects. So we could of course adjust that as we want to. But if I just click OK and use these default settings, we're going to notice there's a lot more variation within these actual light beams here. And as you can see now, that's actually showing up. And we have much brighter areas and darker areas. And we can adjust the size of that node if we wanted to, or the size of the actual texture itself. And the beauty of using the function editor for this is we could just add multiple fractal nodes combining with each other, add some math nodes on there, and just do some neat stuff overall with the entire effect. So some neat stuff you can do with it. And there's also some other lighting options I want to show you. So I'm going to go ahead and actually clear out this scene. Go to File, New, and just select a basic scene, and I'm not going to save. Okay, and now we're going to take a look at some of our selective lighting features. So I'm going to go ahead and load in a couple of basic objects. And just drop them onto the ground. Just load in some spheres. Or actually, I'll do a sphere in a box. How about that? And this way we have other objects in the scene that we can change the lighting for. And what I also want to do is actually add in a spotlight. And I'm just going to use a standard spotlight and move this up. Because some of these features are only available for spotlights and not for our distant type sunlights. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of move these so they're shining onto our object here. And we'll take a look at that. And we can actually delete our sunlight. So now we're dealing with just ambient lighting and our spotlight, which I'm going to up the power for. And there we go. Okay, now if we want to take a look at our shadow and lighting options. So we're going to go on this button right here. We're going to right mouse click and go to Edit Shadow and Lighting. And now we have the ability to turn off our shadows. So we can enable shadows or not. And click OK, and now you see we have no shadows in the scene. And what we could also do is adjust how dark those shadows are. And right now, you're actually unable to make a preview at this point. You have to click OK first in order to show that. So now we can see we have a light shadow in there. There's also some other abilities we have, and that is we have the ability to adjust our light, how linear it is, or if it's quadric, with kind of a filter. We could do a custom if we wanted to and edit that filter, so we could add points just like we did before and get some different lighting effects because of it. What we can also do is variable color. So if we double click on that, we can actually load in a gradient and click OK. And now you see we have a variant color. And just go back into those settings and we can change that to something else. We could use solid colors, create a blue. And depending on the type of light, you might the gradient might be a little bit different. So you might not see exactly the same effect. Remember to turn off variable color, and we're going to take a look at influence. And now we have the ability to say whether or not this light produces specular lighting or diffused lighting. If I turn off diffused lighting and click OK, we're going to see an entirely different type of effect here where we have no diffusion whatsoever. So this is entirely ambient light right now, which is coming from our sky. And we'll go back and turn that back on, and now we can turn off specular. And now we're going to notice, even though we don't have a lot of specularity on these objects, I'm going to go ahead and turn it on for the sphere. We're going to edit the material, go to Effects, or actually we can go to Highlights, and now we have that specular effect on there. We can make it a level of shininess, and click OK, and see if that shows up on our object. And because of our lighting, that's really not showing up too well. It doesn't look like there's any major difference. We'll go back to our spotlight. But we can turn that effect on and off for different objects, depending. See, now we can see it now because we had that specular lighting off. But now that we turn it on, we can actually see that specular effect on the object. So you can turn it off per object if you wanted to, or per light. What we can also do is select which objects are being lit by the light. So right now we could select none and click OK, and now no objects are being lit, which is the same as it was before, where it's all just ambient light. And go back into there, or we can say only objects marked below. So only the cube and the ground are going to be lit by this light. So now this light, or this surface right here, is not being lit up at all. It's still producing a shadow, but the actual object itself is not being lit up by the light, but the ground plane is. What we could also do is select all objects except the ones below. So now only the sphere is going to be lit up. And now we see that is lit up. So we can go in there and make changes depending on what's in the scene and affect our objects, which ones we want lit up by which lights. If we want to do some special effects and things like that, this is a really good tool and a really good editor for that. Like I said, we could also adjust how linear that light is and go ahead and change these. If we go to Custom and Edit Filter, and we can go ahead and add some key points, make it curved, and make a change there. Click OK and OK. And now we see a little bit different of effect in there, depending on what you have. So you can go in there and make those changes and make a lot of different effects just by using that panel. And now I've cleared out our scene, and there's one last thing I want to show you, and that is how to speed up the renders of our ecosystem scenes. And the major thing is, this has to deal with certain lighting. Now, if we have our global ambience on or our radiosity, and we have a very large ecosystem, it could be very difficult to render because it could take a long time, especially when you're bouncing all the light from all those different objects. And if you want a quicker way to render, there's a way to actually do that and actually cancel out those special lighting types just for plant objects. So I'm going to load in a plant right now. And we'll just load in the plum tree and click OK. And now we're going to go ahead and turn on a more advanced lighting effect. And we're going to be using global radiosity and click OK. And now depending on the quality settings and how many objects you have in your scene, this could take a long time to render. But if we have hundreds and thousands of these little trees, what we can actually do is ignore all indirect lighting. So that includes radiosity and global ambience, and we just want that direct lighting on the tree. We can go into our render options, and if we use our user settings, we can check off or turn on ignore indirect lighting on plants and click OK. And what that will actually do is render our tree or any of the plants in an ecosystem or just regular plants, and it'll ignore the indirect lighting. So in other words, the bounced lighting off other objects and certain other types of lighting. So that way we can render much quicker without having to worry about millions of plants or hundreds of thousands of plants in a scene having to bounce light off back and forth all over. So this is a real quick way to speed up your rendering times if you're working with large-scale ecosystems and where you have lots of plants and things like that in the scene.